Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video. In this video, I'll be reviewing the latest season of Australian Survivor. Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawn, which was a complete train wreck of a season, both from a gameplay perspective and from a production standpoint. I mean, the flaws I have here are really similar flaws to what I've had with Australian Survivor in the past, but it does feel like they were amplified with this season. I mean, the editing of the season was really abhorrent, really borderline worse than Champions vs. Contenders 2, which I thought was already pretty terrible. The amount of twists here was completely overboard, really taking what they've done the last couple seasons to the next level. And then you also have the cast being just as inconsistent as ever, with there being numerous duds throughout. But despite those things, I did still actually have a lot of fun with this season, largely due to how much of a mess the gameplay was for a majority of it. But with this being Australian Survivor with its bloated season length, we do have a lot to talk about here, so let's just start running through the season from beginning to end, starting off with the premiere, which starts off in typical Australian Survivor fashion. I mean, we get this really over-the-top opening in a scene that's very reminiscent of like Mad Max, with the players driving these trucks in the middle of the Australian outback towards each other, and it's really just ridiculous. Along the way, we do get introduced to certain members of the cast, which the majority of which we had already seen a good chunk from in the preseason, though we do get a solid introduction to George, where he talks about having the biggest and best brain of them all, and obviously George ends up being a massive star of the show moving forward. We do get the first reward challenge where Brawn does end up winning. However, they did have a massive lead at a point, and Wade does lead the Brains into catching up quite a bit. And a similar sort of situation happens at the immunity challenge as well. And while this is technically a bad start for the Brains, they do actually get a decent immunity streak going moving forward, and really these two tribes were pretty equal when it comes to immunity challenges, which I definitely wasn't expecting in the preseason. Again, I was really expecting Brawn to just dominate, which they end up doing in reward challenges, but I do feel like the immunity challenge did feel a bit more balanced for the two tribes. Now, we don't actually see much of the Brawn tribe's dynamics in this episode, with their segments mostly being devoted to the conditions, though we do get introduced to two major figures here in Shannon and Simon, who both end up going out pre-merge, but their rivalry over the course of this season is a major storyline, which made it even more surprising to me that they did go home so early. At the Brains tribe, right away we do see Haley narrating their arrival at camp, and we see her package about being a pain researcher, and that definitely played a major factor into her being a pretty top winner candidate from pretty early on. Mitch gets a pretty big premiere here, despite him being a non-factor for the rest of his run. He does get propped up as the leader of the tribe here, though in retrospect it really does feel like they were just propelling his edit to prop up George's edit, where George has this one-sided rivalry with him, where George instantly wants to take him out and take control of the tribe, which is something we hear from him a lot over the course of this season. But the consensus seems to be to vote for challenge strength, to which Wei becomes the clear target despite her almost winning the reward challenge for them. But this is where George finds an advantage at the water well that allows him to save 6 players at the first tribal council, and technically this was shown before the immunity challenge, which really made the result here pretty obvious, as again, why would they show George finding this if he never plays it? But this is a twist that I am pretty mixed on, mostly because of its execution. I actually don't mind the concept of half the tribe being safe at the first tribal, as long as they also don't get the vote either. I do think that is an interesting way to shake up the dynamics there. However, I just don't like that it was sprung up on them at tribal, which made it extremely unfair to the people that were left behind there. Obviously, it did make it this big, shocking twist, which it seems like Australian Survivor became obsessed with on this season. But I personally would have liked to see it be played after the immunity challenge. That way the 6 that go to tribal are able to strategize back at camp instead of being really screwed over by the twist here. Now again, this did make tribal really interesting, but it is still pretty unfair. Though before the advantage is played, George does end up going really hard on Mitch at tribal, which again kind of comes out of left field for most of the tribe. And when he saves the 6 people at Tribal, he does it in a way that ends up pissing off the entire tribe. And all of this is pretty bad play from George, which really just sums up a lot of his early game. Also, it is pretty fun to see George being upset how everyone is voting based off of physical strength, only for him to save the people he considers the weakest physically, which is a funny dichotomy there. But with the people remaining, it was pretty clear that Phil was going home, as they were the only ones to get any sort of content about them being worried about going home, to which they end up getting voted out unanimously here. And I was sad to see Phil go home. I really thought they were going to be a fun personality and really seemed to be one of the bigger fans on the tribe. I really like the presence postseason as well. That really makes me disappointed that they were screwed over as hard as they were here, where there wasn't much they could actually even do. I mean, obviously, they could have fought harder during that short portion at Tribal after the advantage was played. But were they really going to change their minds because of that? Probably not. I really just feel like they got screwed over here pretty bad. Now for episode 2, where we instantly see the move from the previous night backfiring on George, with him being the clear target at this point. And Joey starts to get a lot of content here with him leading the charge against George. But most of the content here revolves around the Brawn tribe, where Emmett does get a lot of focus early on here, with him coming off as a pretty big douchebag that acts really cocky at the reward challenge that ends up turning a lot of people off, namely Janelle, who on the offset feels like a massive outcast on this Brawn tribe. And after she messes up the puzzle at the immunity challenge, she does become a very clear target. But we are finally able to see the Brawn tribe's dynamics here, specifically that Emmett, Gavin, and Simon are aligned as the 3 strongest guys on the tribe. And we do see Simon doing a lot of work here in pulling in Chelsea, Danny, and Flick in order to blindside Shannon as the biggest threat outside of the core. But Flick is also shown to be the person in the middle, but they're having a good relationship with Shannon, which that, along with how much Janelle's edit seemed to be leaning towards a downfall, it really made it clear that Janelle was going home here, though we do get some intrigue at Tribal, where she does call out Emmett, and we do get a pretty divided vote here, where the general consensus in Janelle still does end up going home, but Simon's alliance still tries to vote for Shannon and unsuccessfully does so, and Janelle is just completely out of it, voting for Emmett. So again, votes are kind of just going all over the place. And we also have to factor in like Gavin accidentally voting correctly when he didn't get the memo that his alliance was voting for Shannon, which is one of these really bizarre voting blunders that happened on this season. But again, we do lose Janelle, who I did really like during the one episode here that she got any content. I did like her feistiness, especially towards Emmett. Though, again, as a player, I mean, she didn't really do anything right. I mean, for her to be voted out here in a position where she's in the middle of 2 massive sides, and even being voted out when one of those sides was trying to save her, but they don't even involve her in that plan, I just feel like she was just so much on the outs here. Where if she were a better player, she definitely should have been able to integrate herself within one of those 2 sides. So I really don't see much potential coming from Janelle here. Now for episode 3, which was another episode almost solely based around the Brawn tribe, with most of the Brain tribe's content being based around George, as you would expect, with him wanting the tribe to rest before challenges, only for him to go on a walk, during which the tribe gets fire, and he returns talking about how exhausted he is. Again, a pretty humorous moment for him there. But this is also the start of George giving the tribe advice that ends up turning out to be right, as at the immunity challenge, the Brains end up dominating the Brawns due to George solving the brain teaser pretty early on, which to me was indication that we were definitely supposed to be rooting for George moving forward. But on Brawn, they do win the reward challenge, which leads to them getting a photo collage, which again, they've done in recent seasons, but this just feels weird. And it really just feels like an excuse to give these players personal content early on. Gavin does get a bit of a dodo edit here for him obviously not understanding his own alliance's plan in the previous vote. Kez gets a lot of content here with her finding an idol clue, and we get this pretty fun sequence of her recruiting Flick to help her get the idol in front of everyone in camp, and her having to sneak it away, where She isn't wearing much, so she has to like lay down in the middle of the sun so that people don't see the idol, and all this is pretty fun. But the majority does seem locked in targeting Simon's alliance, but the plan is to target Gavin instead of Simon himself. Now, the main intrigue comes from Simon trying to flip over Big D, and Big D gets Simon to agree to vote for Kez over Shannon, which I don't fully get why here. Like, I don't get if Kez already told him about the idol and he wanted to flush the idol, but couldn't he have just done the same thing by going to Kez and telling her that he thinks she needs to play her idol? And again, this makes no sense too, because like from what we were shown, like it seemed like Big D and Kez were pretty close out there. So I really don't get why Big D wanted to do this, but again, that's just more indication of how crazy his gameplay was. But we then get the tribal where Kez does waste her idol there, and Gavin ends up going home. And Gavin was a pretty big disappointment for me coming into the season. I really thought he was going to be the next coming of like a Matt Rogers, with him seeming to have done his research in the preseason, though on the show itself he just seemed to be pretty clueless while out there. I mean, I will give him credit for at least having a few loyal allies, people that wanted to keep him in the game, but I kind of feel like he set himself up in a position similar to that of like Ethan on Winners at War, where he positioned himself in an alliance where he was kind of primed to be the one taken out as collateral damage if they were trying to avoid an idol play, or if they actively wanted to keep the bigger threats in the game around. So again, his positioning was just all around pretty bad here, and to be honest, his run in the show is probably going to be more remembered to me for him voting incorrectly in the previous vote. Now in episode 4, where on the Brains Tribe we get a repeat of the George storyline, but this time in relation to Baden, where Baden follows George on an idol hunt, only for Baden to find the clue. But while Baden is searching for the idol, George ends up realizing what he's doing and finds the idol right under his nose, which is a pretty fun sequence there. Now we do see George showing Wei the idol, which leads to the first sign for her that she might not be fully loyal to him, which obviously is a major factor later down the road. But really the rest of the episode is focused on the Brawn tribe, with Benny getting some content at the beginning of the episode, despite being completely invisible in the edit up to this point, which made it pretty apparent that he was going to be in some serious danger here. Simon gets so much content in this episode with him having his back against the wall, he searches for an idol out in the open, and it's really just set up this fun arc that he ends up going through from this point on. Brawn does win a reward only to lose immunity once again, but a lot of the blame for the immunity loss ends up going onto Benny here for him messing around with the puzzle pieces, and Big D ends up getting a lot of content with him being upset over this. However, the majority does end up deciding to vote for Simon, though Benny ends up leaking this plan to Danny right in front of Gerald, really pissing him off. And at this point, with the amount of negativity Benny has been getting, it was just so clear he was going to get booted here. But obviously Danny ends up going back to Simon and tells him about this, to which Simon ends up using this in order to flip Big D. And with the numbers now tied, we do get him going to Shannon, who does end up waffling quite a bit here, to the point that when they get to tribal, she does make it pretty clear that she is really considering switching her vote, which is such poor gameplay, especially because she ends up not flipping her vote right away at least. But tribal itself is pretty interesting, where we do have a lot of back and forth between Simon and Benny, both fighting for their lives, and I did actually feel bad for Benny here. As you could tell, he was genuinely hurt by his own alliance members considering flipping on him so abruptly. But again, we do end up getting a tie due to Big D flipping, but Shannon and Kez end up flipping on the revote, causing Benny to go home here, which was a pretty crazy way to get to a pretty predictable result based around the edit. But let's talk about Benny, who wasn't on the show until his boot here. Again, his exit was pretty notable, but one that the show really just ends up using more so as a tool to boon Simon's edit over actually defining Benny as a character in his own right. It's also just bizarre to see someone like Benny being looked at as a physical liability, where he is this like really fit guy, which is probably even more of an indictment on his game that he was targeted despite that. I mean, he does seem like a intelligent enough guy to where like I wouldn't be surprised if he were to play again, he would be able to play like a similar game to like a Benji, but that would require him to get another shot, which I don't think he's going to. Now for episode 5, which is a notoriously poorly edited episode here, with only 6 out of the 20 remaining players getting confessionals here, with the 2 potential boots for the episode both not getting a single confessional. I mean, it is ridiculous, but we do start the episode with Shannon getting a lot of the blame for the Benny vote, despite the fact that it was Big D that flipped here. Like, it's bizarre that the edit just completely neglects Big D in this situation, but Simon does remain the target, and almost instantly we do see him finding an idol at camp, and later in the episode, after they win the reward challenge, he ends up finding another idol within the reward, which did really feel overboard that they were having the opportunity for him to get 2 idols over the course of this one episode, really the first half of this episode. It did feel kind of ridiculous, but this obviously sets up the pretty great downfall they ends up having by the end of his run. And we do also see Gerald seeing him find the idol, which is the first major instant of the edit just completely undermining Simon here. But this episode does start a bit of a Brawn winning streak, making this episode mostly focused around the Brawn tribe, as we do see a lot from Joey, with him now being the clear leader of the tribe, putting together a core alliance with Andrew, Laura, and Georgia, and he continues to target George. This is also the first time that the George and Kara relationship ends up being highlighted, which obviously becomes very important moving forward. And we do see George doing some effective work here in using his idol to pull in Baden, creating his own 4-person alliance now with them and Way, and I really was rooting for this group here, but Joey does end up doing effective work here in adding in Mitch, Haley, and Rachel to his group, and essentially making it seem like George's only hope here is for him to be successfully using his idol. And George does make a pretty bold move here in walking into camp with the idol around his neck, which is a really fun moment, but I do think gameplay wise, considering he does end up wasting the idol anyway, he really should have just either kept it a secret and played it for himself, banking on the fact that they voted for him, as in that situation they can't split the votes, or really just not even play the idol, as in that situation obviously they're not going to put the votes on him if they know that he has an idol and they can't split the votes. So I do think this was all kind of a waste. And it also just gives Joey the heads up for him to create another plan, which he ends up executing pretty perfectly here. Now, while George does try to flip over Rachel and Haley, they do end up siding with Joey, as Joey's alliance decides to blindside Mitch. And I did find it really interesting how, despite Haley being one of the swing votes here, it's Rachel that ends up getting all the content about their decision making, which is obviously interesting considering how perfect the rest of Haley's edit ends up being. But we get to the vote where George does end up wasting his idol and Mitch is blindsided instead. And again, Mitch had a really quiet episode here with him getting no confessionals, and really the only scenes that he was shown was him back at camp talking about how confident he is that George is going home, which all this is kind of funny considering how massive a figure he was in the premiere. Like the fact that he's so neglected afterwards and that he's really only shown in the edit because of his rivalry with George really just highlights how bad the editing of Australian Survivor is. But again, like outside of his rivalry with George and him being a doctor, I pretty much know almost nothing about him. So losing him here wasn't that big of a loss. Now for episode 6, which was the first non-elimination episode. Now this was another episode focused around the Brains tribe, as on Brawn, we kind of just get the same storyline again with Simon and how people know about his idol. Brawn ended up winning both of the challenges this episode as well. Though for the reward, they do end up kidnapping a player from Brains, and they do pick Joey, and this reward really just kind of seemed disgusting, in all honesty. Like them drinking a whole bunch of chocolate milk in the middle of this extremely hot outback, that just did not sound appetizing. But back on Brains, the storyline does again revolve around George. Now with him being upset at Rachel for not siding with him in the previous vote, and he expresses his displeasure with the tribe at the reward challenge, which pisses off his tribe even more, so that's fun. Georgia finally gets some content as she follows George around while he's hunting for an idol, to which I was actually expecting Georgia to go home here, especially after George declares her as his target. But that doesn't end up happening. I mean, we finally get content from Kara talking about her bond with George, and she ends up finding an idol, and we do have some debate over who she's going to play it for, especially once Joey once again does impressive work in flipping over Way, which allows them to now split the vote. And we do get this pretty tense scene where Way tells George that she's flipping on him, which is a really terrible move in my eyes. Again, it's pretty clear that Joey had no real interest in working with Way long term, and she just blows up this opportunity where they could have easily won in a plurality vote here. Through her flipping here, she really just gives all the power to Joey, and we get the tribal where Kara wears the idol around her neck, and we do get this pointless section of them playing hot potato with the idol, which again was never really going to do anything. But we do get to a pretty big shocker here where Kara gets around to playing her idol, and she does end up playing it for George, despite the fact that she knows that she's going to be voted out as a consequence, which was a pretty heartwarming moment, especially since George seemed to be really taken off guard and was really emotional for the rest of Tribal. But once Kara leaves Tribal, we find out it's a non-elimination episode where she finds out she'll be swapping over to Brawn. And as a twist, I mean, this is fine. I mean, they've obviously done similar things to this in the past, and again, while ideally we would just have no non-elimination episodes, this twist isn't nearly as egregious as many of the other ones we'll be talking about. And considering the timing of it happening, where it happened to Kara, who had just used her own idol to save George, I felt like it felt pretty fitting here. Now for episode 7, where we obviously do see Kara joining the Brawn tribe, which I found her scaring the tribe in the middle of the night to be a terrible way of introducing herself, but Kara is the focal point of the Brawn tribe's content this episode, with Simon and Shannon fighting for her vote, though all of this doesn't end up mattering as they don't go to Tribal. But Shannon does get a lot of strong strategic content here and did seem to be winning the battle, as Simon does make several missteps here, like him deciding not to talk to her right away, and even when he does, he decides to open the conversation by talking about menopause, which is bizarre. Though I did also find it funny that the Brawn tribe finally loses their first reward challenge now that Kara is with them, which ends up kind of screwing her over in that end, as she still hadn't been on the reward. The immunity challenge here did have an interesting twist where they openly announce that an idol is hidden at the challenge, and we do have this dilemma of helping your tribe with the challenge or going for that idol, and it was fun to see the scramble for the idol that Haley ends up getting. And I did think this was a fun way of hiding the idol, though I do think it would have been more interesting if there was like maybe one per tribe. But even then, like, I do find it ridiculous that Simon could have theoretically had 3 idols this early in the game, which is also just an insane prospect. But Brawn ends up winning the challenge, setting the stage for Haley to make her big move, and overall this episode was really incredible for her, now having an idol and her orchestrating the Joey boot, where she does get the minority together, pulls in George and Baden along with Wei and Rachel in order to pull off this move without having to use her idol. Again, a really great move, though it doesn't end up mattering as we end up swapping immediately afterwards. But had the tribe stayed the same, she would have been in a pretty strong position here. But this was still a really great coming out moment for Haley, and I did think she played pretty optimally throughout most of this episode. But again, we do lose Joey, who was such a massive pre-merge character here. He played exactly like I expected him to in the preseason. He was this like loudmouth leader figure for the Brains, someone that I thought would have been a dominant figure early on, but I was surprised to see him getting taken out before the swap. But I do think that makes his arc even more fascinating. I mean, he did do a lot of good work while he was out there. He did build the majority alliance. He flipped away on George. But all that just kind of unravels on him in this one episode, largely due to the work of Haley. But that said, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him back for another season. I do think there's debate for him being one of the better players of the pre-merge boots here. Now for episode 8, where we do get the formal swap. However, before it, we do see Laura finding an idol on the Brains tribe, which becomes important later in the episode. But again, we do swap, and the new Brawn gets pretty minimal content here, but we do see Haley being happy with how the swap played out despite her being in the minority, so I don't get why. But we also see Shannon and Simon calling a truce, which obviously doesn't last. But again, the new Brains do get the most content here, with them losing the immunity challenge, which I guess I should mention that during the immunity challenge, we do get this ridiculous Suri-esque moment for Wei, which really propped up my idea of her getting this like journey edit over the course of the season. But on the Brains tribe, despite the Brains technically having the majority there, due to George and Kara clearly not wanting to work with the old Brains, the Brawns are able to get the majority, with Laura, Georgia, and Rachel on the bottom. And this could have been a really boring vote, but with Laura now having an idol, it did add a lot of intrigue here. And I do feel like the Brawns actually play this round pretty well for the most part. And this really is a coming out episode for Emmett, who I do think plays pretty well throughout the season in him keeping the Brawn together, despite them being this like really divided group. And I do also like how Big D played, where I think he did a good job in pacifying George, allowing George to decide who the target is, and also allowing him to decide how they split the vote. But this does lead to a lot of confusion, where the plan switches from splitting on Laura and Rachel to Georgia and Rachel, where we get this being portrayed as like, oh, the Brawns are confused over this like really standard vote split. And considering how this episode was promoted as like, oh, it's going to be a crazy vote, and considering I had even seen before I watched the episode that people were talking about how insane this episode is on Twitter, I felt pretty confident someone was going to mess up the split vote here. And when we see that the old brains decide to target Big D as well, I kind of knew what was coming, but I still didn't know exactly how it was going to play out. And I really don't get why they targeted Big D here. Like, they don't really have a great explanation on this show. But once we get to Tribal, we do see like Big D being really cocky, which further led into that notion of him being blindsided here. I mean, we do get to the vote where Laura inexplicitly decides to play her idol on Rachel in a position where the Brawns had the numbers to split the vote, essentially meaning that she could have pulled a Cara here and idled herself out of the game. But she does get very lucky that, one, the vote was split on Georgia, but also the fact that Cara messes up her vote. Again, it really is an insane situation here where, again, I was expecting one of the Brawns to mess up the split. But for Cara, one of the brains to mess up the split makes this even more comical. And I did really love her reaction once she realized that she messed things up. And this leads to a crazy 3-2-1-0 vote where Big D is taken out in pretty spectacular fashion here. Again, another indicator of how much of a train wreck this season was. And I did really like Big D on the show. I mean, his edit was very spotty despite him being a pretty massive swing vote on the initial Brawn tribe, but he did seem like a fun character. I was disappointed to see him get taken out due to such a dumb mistake from Cara's end, but again, it did make for an amazing exit. While he is someone I would be interested in seeing play again, I don't really get the vibe that that's super likely, as it didn't seem like the producers were that in love with him as a character, considering how he was neglected in the edit at points where he shouldn't have been. Now for episode 9, which was another solid episode, largely due to the double tribal, allowing the Brawn tribe to go to tribal, as, I mean, the Brain tribe dynamics were just kind of boring here. The main storyline on the Brains tribe was really just how much Cara messed up the previous vote. Or again, like, she could have potentially sent herself home if the old Brains had decided to vote for her. But her mess up also loses her some trust with the old Brawns as well. And from this point on, she really does come off as pretty unreliable for the rest of the season, where she is left out of a number of complicated plans, seemingly because of how she messed up this one. Obviously, the old Brains do try to turn the vote onto Cara, but it never actually works. And along the way, Georgia is taken out of the game for medical, and we have our first instance of learning about this rule where someone can temporarily leave the game for 24 hours before officially being medevaced, which I really don't like as a rule. As a consequence of this, they end up giving Georgia immunity at the next tribal, which, I mean, to me, the rule should be if you miss a tribal, you're out of the game. I personally don't care how many days they're gone for, as long as they don't miss out on an opportunity to get voted out. I feel like at the point where you're just handing someone immunity, they should be taken out of the game. And I had the same issue with Big Brother AU this latest season where a similar thing happened. But really, this is only the first of the dumb Australian Survivor rules that we'll learn about over the course of this season. Now on Brawn, we do get a lot from Haley, with this being another really incredible display of gameplay, with her again starting the episode down in the numbers, but does do some really effective work. Now, it was benefited by the twist here, where 2 of the Brain members did end up getting immunity, allowing Haley to have 50-50 odds on playing her idol correctly, which made the Brawns turn against each other, and in turn, essentially turning the Brains into the swing votes. Again, pretty impressive work, but it is largely dictated by this round's format that gave the Brawns very few options in terms of who to target. But through all this, Shannon seems to be the first one to flip, with her trying to flush out Simon's idol and then telling Haley to vote for Chelsea to weaken Simon. Danny then brings up voting for Shannon and approaches Haley about that, and this all seems to happen almost immediately after returning to camp, as the people on the reward hadn't even come back yet. And while we do see the Brains siding with voting out Shannon, we never actually get that much of an explanation over why they did so, which I did find interesting, again, particularly pertaining to Haley's edit. But let's talk about the twist itself, which is that once they get to the immunity challenge, they are told that there is going to be a double tribal where 2 people from each tribe are given individual immunity. I did like the setup for this challenge, where it was designed to be a team challenge, though it did set up this dilemma of helping out your tribe to maintain your social capital or having to play for yourself in order to get immunity. I did also like the final bag tossing part of the challenge, which was essentially just a crapshoot, where despite challenge beasts like Emmett and Andrew winning, we also got Wei and Rachel winning immunity as well. Now, things do play out similarly up until the vote, where we do see Laura and Shannon both getting blindsided there, but obviously a twist was coming, and I was expecting this to be a redo of what they did on All-Stars, where there they had a fire-making challenge between the two, but instead here we get the twist that the immunity winners get to decide who goes home, in that it needs to be a unanimous vote, which I don't love this element of Australian Survivor really focusing on the physical game, as obviously this gives the people that win physical challenges the right to vote. But I do think it led to some really fun intrigue here, where Andrew and Rachel seem to be pro Laura, while Way and Emmett were pro Shannon. But Simon ends up revealing that Shannon was the first one to flip on the Brawns, which causes the vote to entirely flip on Shannon so quickly in a way that I did find it kind of humorous. But through that, we do lose Shannon here, and I was shocked to see Shannon go home. I mean, Shannon's someone that, while her winner prospects had dropped by this point in the season, I was still expecting her to reach the merge and for her to be getting the better of Simon by the end of the season, with Simon always being undermined whenever their rivalry was shown. But no, I mean, she gets neither of those things. Again, she even gets taken out over Laura here, which I thought was a massive surprise as well. I mean, again, I was expecting this to be a very clear Laura boot. Now, the show did portray Shannon as a really great player, which I do think she is a competent player, though I do question her decision-making at points, and I do think the edit does give her probably a bit too much credit along the way, but I do think she is, again, one of the better pre-merge boots, and someone I definitely wouldn't be opposed to see playing again. Now for episode 10, which was probably one of the duller episodes of the season, where I did feel like the boot here was pretty clear, and it did focus on the Brains tribe, which just isn't that interesting of a tribe here. The Brawn's only real storyline here was them setting up Simon's blind side, with Flick now clearly being on the bottom and Haley wanting to pick her up in order to take down Simon. On Brains, we essentially get a retread of the previous round, where the minority once again tries to flip the vote on Kara, and it doesn't work. And it really made no sense for it to work either, when they really are focused on flipping over Kez, where if like Kez is the only one to flip here, it would just cause a tie. So like, why would she want to do that? Georgia does end up returning to the game here, and for some reason that seems to put a target on her back, which I found bizarre, like with Emmett talking about how big of a threat she is because she proved that she has what it takes to get back in the game. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, it makes no sense to me. But really, the only intrigue in this episode was how non-committal Kez was along the way, to the point where, like, even at Tribal, Emmett was, like, really having to argue his case. But again, realistically, I just never saw any other outcome outside of Georgia going home here. And Georgia was there. I mean, she was pretty boring while she was there and didn't seem to be playing that aggressively, though now knowing what she had to deal with while she was out there, having suffered from an ectopic pregnancy, obviously that does play a factor here. But I was still overall pretty underwhelmed with what she ended up bringing to the show, especially considering how high I was on her before the season. Now for episode 11, where we start the episode with Rachel finally getting her intro package, again in episode 11, making it pretty clear that she was probably going to be the boot here. And probably even more indicting to her, considering how prominent she was in the edit before this. So it really makes us question, like, why is she getting her intro now? The Brawns get more of the same storyline, this time with Haley approaching Danny to flip on Simon, which shouldn't have worked, but considering how much of a loose cannon Danny ends up being, it does end up being effective. Now the players do get letters from home to bloat out the episode even more. And Haley in particular gets a ridiculous amount of content here, with her talking about her boyfriend, and pretty much just locks in her winner edit for me. On the Brawn tribe, Rachel is the clear target, and we do get Emmett talking about throwing immunity challenges to get rid of the Brains, and ends up really only doing it for this one episode. But the Brains end up getting stuck at the puzzle at the beginning of the challenge, and Brawn just dominates from there. Now at this point, Rachel does actually start to play a bit, with her approaching George to try to ruin the vote split in order to vote out Emmett, and I will be honest, I did think there was at least a semblance of a shot that this was going to happen, but it doesn't, and Rachel ends up getting voted out in a 3-2 vote. And Rachel was fine. I mean, I'll be honest, I did find her kind of annoying throughout a lot of the season. She did seem to be a pretty emotional player, someone that wasn't really willing to work with people that she didn't like, outside of the point where Haley convinces her to vote against Joey. And obviously now, but again, it's just too late. I really feel like she just played too late. She should have been trying to get George and Kara back on her side back around the time of the swap, but for her to wait this late into the swap just felt like a death sentence for her. Now, she did get a decent amount of screen time here, despite not being one of the main characters of the season. But again, for me, I just didn't find her that enjoyable of a person to watch on the show. Now for episode 12, where we have the final episode before the merge. And I was expecting this one to be pretty boring. I was expecting Laura to be voted out here, but we end up getting the culmination of Simon's storyline a bit quicker than I was expecting. And most of the Brain Stripes content revolves around Laura being at the bottom, and they do end up winning a reward, which leads to the reward where they go one at a time, with this being the Survivor candy store, which was not as notable of an instance of this as when we've seen like Benji or David go on this reward. But they do end up having a random draw to pick the order, and Kara ends up going first and ends up finding the advantage, which is a really bizarre one. And I really don't get exactly how this works, where her power is to attend the next tribal along with another player of her choice, and they get to vote at the opposing tribe's tribal. And this advantage really just sucks. I mean, it's so circumstantial and really just causes unnecessary chaos. I also don't get like why they introduced it now. Like, what happens if Brains lose immunity? Does she have to play it to bring 2 Brawn members over to her tribe? Or does she just never get to play it when like the merge is like right around the corner? It's so bizarre to me this is even an advantage. Like, it's really just all around pretty bad. But she does end up using it so that herself and George can go to tribal once they do win the immunity challenge, which Haley is pretty easily able to work around by using them to help her split the vote later in the episode. But the Brawn tribe is where most of the gameplay is happening, with this episode revolving around the downfall of Simon, but also showcasing this as Danny's big move, which was a really dumb move. Again, while Simon does get some flack in the edit for telling Danny and Chelsea that he has 2 idols, it is also dumb for Danny to think that this is when she has the turn on him. Like, Simon is someone that was one of her closest allies in the game. He was someone that was willing to play his idols on her. He openly says that. And for her to just snipe him out of the game here really just leaves her with very few allies moving forward, and really just feels like a massive mistake. Now we do have Danny pulling in Haley to make this move, and they do end up throwing the immunity challenge to get rid of Simon. This is where Haley gets some pretty strong content, with her deciding to split the vote between Simon and Danny, as she wants to protect Flick, which I thought was a good move at the time. However, I do think in retrospect was probably not the correct move, as I really don't get why Haley cared so much to save Flick here. Which, I mean, I do think you have to credit Flick for building a bond with Haley to where Haley wanted to protect her, but in doing so, this really just causes Haley to burn her relationship with Danny, while also not even getting Flick's loyalty along the way. So while this did seem like an impressive move at the time, I do think it turned out to be a pretty big mistake. But again, I did like how they utilized the twist with George and Kara to their advantage, where they got Baden to tell George and Kara where to vote, which allowed them to split the votes here in the first place. But once we're at tribal, again, it's pretty clear that Simon is going home here. I mean, he does go home with 2 idols in his pocket. And I will say that while the show tries to show this as this big, massive moment, I was pretty underwhelmed by all of it. Now, I've talked about this on my live streams that, again, like, I think the basic concept of someone going home with an idol in their pocket is not even that interesting. To me, the more interesting result would have been like Simon playing one of his idols and Danny going home because of that. That would have been a great downfall for Danny there, and also demonstrate some strong gameplay along the way. But without that, it's just a guy getting blindsided in a pretty foreshown way, now with 2 less idols in the game. But let's talk about Simon, who was such a massive figure here in the pre-merge. Again, I was surprised to see him go before the merge. I was always expecting him to be a boot around the merge, like either the merge boot or taken out very soon afterwards, kind of like a David. But to see him go here was pretty unexpected. And to tag Shannon along with this, I really thought their rivalry was going to be such a major storyline throughout most of the season. Again, I thought it was going to last until the merge. With both of them out pretty early here, it really puts a lot of the focus on the back half of the season onto people like George and Haley and a little bit of Danny and Emmett. Now, I was surprised at how great of a character Simon was, though, as, again, I was really expecting him to be a dud in the preseason. But he ended up being a pretty fun player, and someone that seemed to be genuinely passionate about the game, and someone that I definitely would like to see play again down the road, as I do feel like he's someone that's always going to play hard every time he plays. Now for episode 13, the Merge episode, which continues off of Survivor South Africa Immunity Islands as being one of the best Merge episodes in recent history, but before the merge, we do get the ramifications of the Simon vote, where we do see Haley openly admitting to orchestrating the split against Danny, which I do think was a pretty big misstep on her end. I mean, it obviously pisses off Danny and causes Danny to target her moving forward, which I do think really shows that probably the best move for Haley would have been to tip off Simon for him to play his idol and end up taking out Danny. But instead, Haley now comes into the merge with this massive target on her back, with people actually targeting her. But once we get to the merge, we have an individual war challenge instead of your traditional feast, where the placements in the challenge allow them to get first pick out of a set of rewards on a table. And I think this is a fun twist here, though realistically doesn't add much to the season. They end up naming the merge tribe the Fire Tribe, which is one of the worst merge names possibly ever. But the dynamics at the merge here are really interesting, actually, where the Brains did have a 7-6 majority, but with George and Kara being two of those Brain votes, it did leave it pretty open here, with George and Kara seemingly siding with the Brawn. But again, just having George in a swing vote position is just so much fun for the show. And we do see Haley going to Flick and Gerald, trying to get them to flip, but ends up being unsuccessful. And again, really just showing how much a misstep I feel like it was for Haley to end up splitting the vote on Danny to save Flick, as again, it really just didn't gain her anything. But I do feel like Haley clearly takes the leadership role here with the Brains group, which I do think is something new to see from someone of her archetype. It was nice to see someone like her being the one to literally get the group together and being presented as a domineering figure. But we obviously get a lot of George in this episode, with him being a double agent, and all of that is obviously pretty fun. Emmett wins his first immunity challenge, starting his storyline of being this massive challenge beast. And again, I feel like Emmett plays this merge pretty well. Again, he very impressively gets the Brawn together and creates this plan to flush Haley's idol by putting the votes onto Laura, who I do think is a decent choice for a target here, as she is one of the more unpredictable targets. But at the same time, we do see Kez find an idol right in front of the entire Brawn alliance, and this is where George's plan of being the double agent really kicks off, where he goes to Haley and literally just tells her exactly what to do. He tells her to play the idol on Laura, tells her to vote for Kez, and to do a minority vote split on Danny. This really incredible plan that, while I had no doubt that it was going to go through, especially with the way it was presented, it did make this episode really riveting to watch, to see all the pieces coming together. And it really ends up going off without a hitch, and I really loved Kez's reaction to her being voted out. But this is where we do get a bit of a controversy here, where after being voted out, Kez ends up handing her idol to Flick, which within the rules of Australian Survivor is still in play, which this is such a terrible rule, that advantages can be transferred between players before their torch is snuffed, which, again, if this was the US, this idol would be void, as the last time to transfer advantages is before the votes are read. But on these international versions, because it's also Survivor South Africa, this is a similar thing, they are able to transfer idols. Now, I do think there is an argument for why this would be good TV, as I do think this incentivizes players to flush out idols, forcing their opposition to play idols instead of just strictly voting people out with idols in their pocket, which I've already said, again, I don't think is as interesting as the former. And I do think it also could lead to more dynamic gameplay, but in an ideal world, again, for the integrity of the game, I do wish this rule would be removed, though I suspect the Australian Survivor production doesn't care, and they're going to keep it. But let's talk about Kez, who I really liked on this season. I mean, while Kez was not the most prominent figure on the show, I did like how she played the game. She was someone that found multiple idols during her stint here. She seemed like a competent enough player, and she also seemed like a fun personality, despite her not being a highlight on the show. And I would like to see her play again at some point down the road, as I do feel like she has a decent amount of potential to play pretty well on a return. Now for episode 14, which for me is kind of where the game goes off the rails, and this is one of the most egregious twists of the season. We also do see George being really high on his move from the last episode, and it is made pretty clear here that George plans on executing the pendulum strategy, where you go back and forth between alliances, knocking out someone from each alliance every other round, which he wants to do with Kara and Baden alongside him. And Baden starts to get a lot of focus here, with George wanting Andrew out in order to get Baden all to himself. But we also see the Brawns talk about getting Baden out to isolate George and Kara, which definitely sets up Baden here as a major potential boot over the course of this episode. We do also get to the immunity challenge where we find out the first part of the twist where 3 people will win immunity and will be the only ones voting in this round, which I hate this twist. I mean, I really hate how much Australian Survivor harps on physical strength. Again, similar to that previous twist, but even worse here where it's portrayed as these 3 being the sole votes that will determine the vote out. It's just not ideal, but also we end up having Emmett, Andrew, and Danny winning the immunity here. And because of this twist, Baden kind of gets screwed over here, as with the Brawns now not needing George and Cara to vote out their target, they actually have the power to get rid of Baden, when in a true vote, George and Cara are never going to go along with that plan. And even between the Brawn, Emmett has to fight pretty hard to convince Danny to vote for Baden over Haley. So I do think Baden gets screwed over here. Now, along the way, Haley does end up getting really paranoid as well and does end up snitching on George to Danny, which I do think was the wrong move for her position. Now, I know some people excuse this over saying she wouldn't have done this if it wasn't for the twist, but I don't really agree with that assessment, as I don't even think it was necessarily due to this situation that she does so, as Haley even talks about this in the previous episode, that she could snitch on George whenever she wants, and I do feel like just in general, I think that's just who Haley is as a player. But then we get the tribal where, again, it's pretty clear that Baden is going home until we find out the second part of the twist, which is even more ridiculous and feels very riggy to me, where we find out that the 3 people that won immunity are not going to be the ones to vote. They only have a chance to vote, and we're going to have a fire-making challenge to decide the sole vote to evict, which very much screams out to me as production really wanting a brain to take out a Brawn in this situation, considering, again, like, this was not brought up at all at the time of the immunity challenge, and for the challenge to be a fire-making challenge, something that Andrew was known to be very good at, again, it very much screams out to me that they were trying to get a certain result here, but even then they fail at it because Andrew kind of sucks. Though I will say that I did love how much the edit just kind of dunks on Andrew here, of him being propped up as like the obvious winner, but he ends up breaking his flint right away, and through that Danny ends up winning the challenge, getting the sole vote here, and proceeds to vote out Baden, who does get saved by this being a non-elimination round where he gets sent to Redemption Rock, which is obviously pretty similar to like Redemption Island or Edge of Extinction, which normally I would hate, but considering how screwed over Baden was to begin with, I actually didn't mind him getting saved here. Now for episode 15, where we get another mess of an episode. After seeing Baden on Redemption Rock, we do learn that Chelsea had been taken away by medical after the previous tribal, and later in the episode we do learn that she has been officially medevaced. So let's just talk about her now. I mean, Chelsea was there. I mean, again, I think it's a shame how minimal of an edit she got. Again, coming into the season, I was pretty high on her potential as a player, but she really gets shown to be doing pretty much nothing over the course of this season, with almost all of her content going to Danny, who is obviously the more important figure on this season, but it is a shame that Chelsea gets completely neglected because of that. And really, again, like, I have almost nothing to really say about her just because she was barely on the show. But let's continue on with the episode where Danny does get a lot of content over her losing Chelsea. Now we do get a lot of sloppiness from George, where he continues to leak information to the brains, including the fact that Flick now has an idol, which does end up backfiring on him by the end of the episode. Haley's game ends up unraveling here, where Emmett does tell George about Haley ratting him out, which causes George to go all out against Haley here, and also gives us a really ridiculous confessional where George says, "Don't throw me under bus, my bus is bigger and badder than yours," which is so ridiculous. Now Emmett wins immunity again, and with George putting a lot of work to take down Haley, with him turning Andrew against her, it was pretty clear that Haley was getting voted out here, though it was definitely a surprise based on how I saw this season playing out, as by this point I was 100% on Haley winning this season. I remember I even talked about on stream about like, oh, if Haley plays as well as she did in the pre-merge, in the post-merge, she could be one of the best winners of all time. But that clearly obviously didn't work out here. But for her to literally just be straight up voted out here, especially in the unanimous vote, is just such a massive knock against her game. Though Haley doesn't go out without a fight, she does fight pretty hard at Tribal, getting into an argument with George, and dropping the bomb that she knows about Flick's idol, which all this felt like it was never going to work, as it more so just shows how much of a loose cannon Haley can be, and doesn't really dissuade the majority from not just taking her out first and then taking out George next. Like, there's no real reason that she's giving that George needs to go right now. Afterwards, she obviously goes to Redemption Rock, where I did like the scene between her and Baden, where Baden just calls out all of the mistakes she's made in the game. But we do end the episode with the challenge between the two, where the winner returns to the game and the other becomes the first member of the jury, which did blow my mind. I mentioned this in my midseason power ranking that I was expecting a Haley Baden final too, for a good chunk of the pre-merge. And for one of them to be guaranteed to be going home here was definitely a shock. Now, in retrospect, Baden's edit could be rationalized as a first juror sort of edit, again, because typically the first juror is edited in a way to where they're pretty consistently shown the show, and again, that was pretty much Baden's edit. By the time, I was definitely surprised to be losing him here. And again, for me, Baden gets massively screwed over. I don't think there was any way Baden was going home under a traditional vote. Again, George and Kara would have never gone along with it. His own brains wouldn't have gone along with it in most scenarios. I do think Baden is a player that had a lot of potential on this season as well. I mean, while he's not the most active player in the world, he did seem to play the second command role pretty well through his relationships with George and Haley. And he did seem to have a fairly accurate read on the game as well. Plus, also through him having those integral relationships that should have kept him safe, I do come out of this season being pretty high on him as a player, despite how dull he is as a character. Now for episode 16, in which this entire week's worth of episodes were pretty strong, with each of them leading to a really fun vote out that all felt pretty radically different from each other. But we do start the episode with Haley returning to the game, where she still seems to be a bit of a social pariah, but she does get a lot of content about her learning from her mistakes. That really did set up this redemption arc for her moving forward. But with Haley returning and Chelsea gone, George now looks at this as an opportunity to get the brains back together and take control of the game. But first we get a reward challenge where Gerald, Flick, Danny, Laura, and Wei win a reward. And on this reward, with this random grouping of people, Danny decides to just make an alliance with them, which comes off as super awkward. Again, like, this group has nothing in common, but again, I think this just really shows the faults in Danny's gameplay, where she's just so willing to make new groupings and flip on her own allies, and doing so seemingly at the first possible opportunity, despite it not being in her best interest to do so. And she decides to start targeting Emmett here, to which Flick and Gerald are completely not on board. And they instantly go back to Emmett and tell him about the plan, completely blowing up the entire Brawn alliance here. And with Andrew winning immunity, leaving it open for Emmett to be taken out here, this did really play into George's plan pretty perfectly, where now with Danny going for Emmett and Emmett going for Danny, George now has the opportunity to take control of the game by getting the brains together, while also turning the Brawns against each other, and getting Flick to flush her idol by playing it for Emmett as well. It really is a perfect situation for him, and he does end up putting the votes onto Gerald, taking him out, which I don't fully get why Gerald seemed to be a target for the brains for the last few rounds. We see this even in the Baden boot episode, where the brains were targeting Gerald, and it's like, it's never explained why. And really just Gerald's edit as a whole really just shows a problem with the Australian Survivor edit, where again, he didn't get a single confessional in his last 9 episodes, including his boot episode. That's pretty ridiculous. So again, we just really don't know what he was doing in the game, but this blindside was pretty beautiful to watch. Again, another really satisfying plan to see George execute here, kind of in line with the merge episode. But again, let's talk about Gerald, who was there. Again, he did get sporadic content here and there in the pre-merge, and seemed like one of these people that should have been a notable character, but he just gets purpled in the edit in the back half of his run here, which I do think is a massive shame, because I do think it's clear that he was doing things out there. He seemed to be maneuvering through the game along with like Flick and Kaz, and obviously was targeted for some reason, but we just never see any of that. Now for episode 17, which starts off with Laura pretending to be a whale, so I mean, that's something. But we do see the ramifications of the Gerald boot, with the Brawns now being left with only 3 people and just really struggling to get back together. But out of nowhere, we do get content from Flick, where she talks about her family and her mom in particular, who suffers from dementia. And we find out later in the episode that her mom had sadly passed while she was out there, which is obviously heartbreaking and probably your worst nightmare when playing a game like this where you're separated from your family. And obviously you have the feel for her in this situation, though she does end up staying in the game. But moving forward, we do get another twist, this being another one that greatly favors the more physical players, where the first 5 to finish the challenge are safe, meaning that only the bottom 4 can be voted for, which again, not ideal. Like, why are you adding in these random twists like this? But to be fair, it is certainly better than some of the other twists that we've already talked about, where again, at least everyone gets to vote here. Now, Andrew ends up winning this challenge, and from what I understand, he was actually given an extra vote, but it just simply wasn't shown in the show because it didn't end up mattering. But I find that kind of humorous that he ends up putting 2 votes on Kara, in a position where he could have easily just split the vote. But through this challenge, most of the big names end up getting immunity here, leaving only Kara, Danny, Wei, and Laura as the remaining targets. And kind of out of nowhere, Kara just starts getting targeted, with Andrew seeming to lead the charge. And again, I don't fully get why. It's never really explained. Like, they talk about how, oh, Kara's a manipulator, but it's like, is she though? And I also just find it so bizarre how they just openly talk about targeting her in front of George and think that George would be okay with this. But this is where George's idol comes into play. Now, earlier in the episode, George did find a key that leads to an idol hidden at Tribal Council that he gets to play anonymously, which I do really like the thought of this anonymous idol. It does obviously have some pretty subtle differences between a regular idol having to play it when you cast your vote, which changes up the dynamic there a bit. And I would like to see this twist back, but this also just seemed like the perfect time to use it. I mean, the vote seemed to be solely going on to Kara. Again, they weren't splitting the vote for whatever reason. But I did find it interesting how George doesn't end up even informing Kara about what's going on here. Again, really just showing how unreliable the players must think she is after what happened at the Big D vote. And it is really ridiculous that George decides to just signal to her to vote for Laura in the middle of Tribal, which I do question his choice in targets here. I mean, while Laura, in an ideal situation, would be one of the better targets for him, as he barely has a relationship with her, I do think it causes him to burn his relationship with Andrew, which causes Andrew to go all out in targeting him moving forward. While I do think him targeting Danny wouldn't have been a terrible move for his game either. So I do question the choice of target, though either way it ends up working out for him. Now, obviously, George's idol play is successful here, and George does play dumb the entire time, despite it being pretty clear that Haley knows exactly what just happened, and Laura ends up getting voted out here in what is another, again, pretty fun blindside. But Laura is someone that seemed to pretty much only be getting content when it was absolutely necessary. I mean, she was in the top half of like confessional getters throughout a good chunk of the season, particularly due to how much content she got in the post-swap. But to me, she wasn't that notable of a figure. I mean, despite the fact that she gets taken out due to strange circumstances here, she also just seemed like a mediocre player as well, where, yeah, she was decently positioned on the initial Brawn tribe, but even then gets blindsided when Joey goes home. I feel like she does pretty bad work in the post-swap, being on the bottom the entire time, and having to be saved by a twist, and also almost idling herself out of the game. Which makes it so that I do feel like she just got very lucky in the fact she made it as far as she did. Now for episode 18, where we do see the ramifications of George playing the idol on Kara, with her obviously thanking him, which did feel like their storyline had kind of gone full circle by this point, with them now having saved each other with idols. We do also see him giving Kara the key so that she can pretend that she was the one that did it. But again, did George actually think this was going to work? I mean, seeing how genuinely shocked Kara was when the idol was played on her, and just by basic logic, you can really just assume that George was probably in on this plan, which makes it just even more ridiculous when George continues to pretend he didn't do it, and we just cut to Andrew, who is like clearly pissed off, with him crossing his arms, looking really annoyed, where he talks about needing George out, which is why, again, I do question if Laura was the right boot there. And it does seem like the cast finally figures out that George and Kara are this dynamic duo, which, again, how do they not know this already, considering how they maneuvered through the game beforehand? But this is also where we essentially see Andrew defecting over to Brawn by creating a Final Four deal with Emmett and Flick along with Haley, and even further cementing himself with the Bronze at the reward challenge, where Danny wins a car and takes Emmett, Flick, and Andrew with her to where, again, like at this point, it did seem like Andrew fully flipped over. But I do think George does some pretty effective work in this position where he is able to flip Haley and Wei to his side by making them feel like they're on the bottom. But I also feel like Haley does really effective work in this episode as well, with her taking advantage of this George situation to usurp his position as the double agent and as a swing vote. Now making George and Kara the targets, Haley also does end up winning immunity here after the Brawns create this plan to throw the challenge after George drops out, which leaves Emmett wide open here, really for the first time since the merge. This is the first time he doesn't have any semblance of immunity, whether that be an immunity necklace or an idol or a twist that's helping him out. And if you are Haley here, to me, this is such an obvious move of who to vote out here, as George to me is the perfect meat shield in being this person, kind of similar to a David Wright or a Christian Hubicki, where you have this person who is very unlikely to win challenges, but is also being looked at as a massive social threat in the game. I think something that's even better for George is that he does rub some people the wrong way as well, to where despite him being a threat, he is also someone that isn't necessarily guaranteed to win a jury vote. And comparing him to an Emmett, this figure who can legitimately win out from this point forward, and is also someone you have less of a relationship with, and is someone that does have some pretty diehard allies, it's like, why are you not taking Emmett out? I mean, to me, this is just such a clear-cut case of what to do here, and we do see Haley obviously executing on it. Now, along the way, Kara does end up finding an idol as well, which also added to the fact that, again, I never really thought George was going home, as I do feel like she probably would have played it on him in the circumstance that they weren't told for sure that George was safe. And the edit itself doesn't even try to hide that Emmett's going home either, where like we blatantly just see Haley voting for Emmett, and he does end up getting voted out in a 4-3-1 vote, with the new majority here winning out due to the opposition splitting the vote, which is also a fun element of this vote here. And losing Emmett here just felt right. I did really like Emmett by the end of the season. I mean, he was essentially a lesser version of David, but he was still a really entertaining figure, and it was also probably one of the better players on this season, where again, I did find his work in keeping the Brawn tribe together to be pretty impressive. Though I do think in retrospect, when we really assess his post-merge game, a lot of that comes from the fact that he was immune for so much of it. But Emmett is still another one that I wouldn't be opposed to see play again down the road, as I do feel like he has demonstrated a level of potential over the course of this season. Now for episode 19, which to me was a bit of a slower episode after a string of pretty strong ones, and really just leads to this week of episodes being kind of boring to me. But Wei finally gets a confessional for the first time since the merge, again really showing how ridiculous her edit was here. But Wei is all over this episode, with her being the swing here, with Andrew, Danny, and Flick now on the bottom, and her initially wanting to save Andrew. Danny once again tries to make an alliance during the reward challenge, where it ends up being all women there, and she tries to make an all women's alliance now that there are 5 women left by the time of the final 7 here, which never really seemed like a realistic possibility considering how close George and Kara were and how big of jury threats I felt like Danny and Flick were at this point in the game. And for Haley to just burn more allegiances without that much of a benefit just didn't seem to be in her best interest. I did find it interesting that Kara got content about her having to reel George in, especially in his conversations with Wei, where Wei wants Flick gone, but George really wants Andrew gone, which does cause some friction there. But after Haley wins immunity, George does a pretty bold move here of just straight up lying to Wei about Andrew, saying that Andrew is targeting her, and she just ends up believing it, which I really don't get why, considering how much anti-George content we got from Wei throughout the season. So this did feel weird for me that this actually worked, but it does end up keeping Wei in line in order for them to vote out Andrew here. But there's a twist, where there are 4 urns at Tribal, where the person that is voted out has to break one of those urns, and inside one of them is a save scroll, where the person that breaks the urn with the save scroll is safe and returns to the game with no consequence. This is a terrible twist. I mean, it's not game breaking, especially with people knowing about it before the vote, but it's just so boring. I mean, it essentially just leads to a dud episode where no one goes home, and I really don't get how this would have worked if it got dragged out to the last urn. Like, would there literally be an episode where no one cares about what's going on because they know no one's actually going home? Like, it's such a bizarre twist. But we still do end up losing Andrew here, who, again, got a pretty quiet edit for most of the season. He seemed to me to be one of the more clear examples of someone who basically knew nothing about the game coming into the season. It is bizarre how, despite him being a YouTube personality, he did seem pretty dull on TV up until his last couple episodes. Even when he was entertaining there, it was more so due to him being like very grumpy and pouty than him actually being that entertaining or that notable in his confessionals. I mean, yeah, I know we didn't see many of his confessionals, but even in those that we saw, he just seemed to be kind of boring, and gameplay-wise, he just seemed to be mostly just a follower for a lot of the season, where he doesn't really execute any plans, and when he does try, he ends up failing in almost everything. Really, his best move the entire season might be the fact that he votes for Flick in this episode, but even that didn't lead to anything. So for me, I just felt like Andrew was just a complete dud on the season. But now for episode 20, which was straight up a pointless episode. I think this is probably the worst episode of the season just because of how dull it was and how much it didn't matter. The vote itself was already pretty boring, but the earn twist does come into effect here, really just making it entirely pointless. Way does continue to get more content here with her and Haley being the swing votes, but again, it doesn't make sense for them to flip here, especially when factoring in the earn twist, which would essentially make them backstabbing George and Cara to not even matter. We do get some humorous content from George being the last man standing and him really playing it up for the camera. Danny ends up winning immunity, and after that, Flick is the obvious vote out here, which is extremely boring, where it was even clear at Tribal that Danny and Flick knew that they had no shot. But for some reason, Cara ends up wasting her idol here, which makes no sense to me. Like, I really don't get how her read could be that wrong to where she ends up wasting her idol here. She plays it for herself in a position where no one was voting for her. Also in a position where she had a chance to get back into the game even if she was voted out through the earns. And also by her playing the idol, she leaves the idol open for someone else to find in the next round, which could have backfired on her. I mean, to me, it's entirely pointless and really makes no sense for her to do so, but she did it. But whatever, Flick gets voted out, ends up getting save scroll. Pointless episode. Let's move on. And then we move on to episode 21, where we get more of the same. I mean, we get Danny and Flick trying to flip over Haley and Way against George and Cara again, but this time without the earn twist and with the concept of, oh, Cara wasted her idol, which exposed that she was hiding things from Haley and Way. But again, like, was that ever really going to change anything? This episode, though, focuses a lot more on Haley. Again, the previous couple episodes have focused more so on them flipping Way. This time, Haley gets the majority of the content with her being taken on the reward, where again, I was never really convinced that she was ever flipping because it just doesn't make sense for her to do so when you have Danny and Flick, these two massive physical and jury threats in the game, who are also very close and very loyal to each other. Again, comparing them to George and Cara, who are less likely to win challenges, less likely to win a jury vote, particularly Cara, who I think is a massive jury go on this season. So really, there was no decision here. Again, it's very clear who you should be voting out here. And I also feel like the concept of Danny continuously winning challenges in this endgame stretch, where she wins almost every reward challenge. She just won the last immunity. I mean, she almost wins this immunity again. I think this is just further painting a target on her back. That just made it even more clear that she should be the target here. Now, along the way, we do see Flick end up finding an idol, to which she does debate whether or not she should use it. And I'm personally, again, like, why? Why are you going to use the idol here? There's no point. First up, it should be clear that Danny is the target over you. Second, there's still a chance that Haley and Way flip over, which would mean you would waste your idol. Third, you're about to get into a situation at the final 5 where it's the final time for you to use the idol, which means if you don't use the idol here, you're guaranteed final 4, where you only need 1 or 2 more challenges, depending on if it's a final 2 or 3, to get to the end of the game in a situation where you have a lot of friends on the jury. I mean, to me, there's just no reason for Flick to even consider playing the idol here, which, again, she doesn't play, but it shouldn't have even been a consideration to begin with. But it did seem like Flick and Danny were pretty confident in the plan going through this time, though it doesn't. We get a 3-way tie between Danny, Flick, and Cara, where Danny is taken out on the revote, which I should mention that by Danny going home here, we are essentially now left with a final 5 that were all safe by twists by this point in the season, which is insane, and again, more indicative of how crazy this season is and how ridiculous this season is, where we have George, someone that was saved by Cara playing her idol on him. We have Cara, who was voted out of the game and came back into the game, and even beyond that was also saved by George playing an idol on her. We have Haley, who was voted out and came back through Redemption Rock. We have Wei, who was saved in week 1 by George's advantage, where he saved people at that first tribal. And then we have Flick, who literally got saved by the Earn Twist in the previous episode. Again, it's really insane that these are the people that we're left with at this point in the season. But before moving on, let's talk about Danny, who was such a massive player on this season, but not necessarily a good one. I mean, she is one of the reasons why this season was as crazy as it was, considering she was all about the big moves and taking out threats at the first opportunity, even if it didn't make sense for her to do so. Again, her targeting Simon and Emmett were just all really abysmal moves for her game, and both end up backfiring on her pretty early on. Now, I do think she has a lot of natural skill for the game, as I do feel like she was pretty respected out there, and she seemed to be liked socially, and she has a lot of agency within the game. However, I do think her poor strategic outlook on the game is what's going to harm her in most situations. Though if she were able to reel that back, I think she could potentially be a really strong player on a return. Now for episode 22, where we do get more of the same storylines. I mean, Flick is the clear target, but she has an idol, so we know she's not going home. And we do see her once again campaigning to Wei and Haley to get rid of George. And again, it just feels like we're seeing the same episode over and over and over and over again. But here we do get some content where Haley thinks that she's more liked than George, which was the first time I actually believed that there was actually a realistic possibility of them getting to the end, especially when George himself is in confessional talking about how his best chance to win the game is against Haley. But we do see more of Wei talking about how George isn't self-aware, with her talking about how mean he is and he doesn't realize it, which is a pretty damning thing to see for his jury chances there. During the immunity challenge, we get another ridiculously over-the-top moment involving Wei, where we do have George going back to help her through an obstacle, which is questionable from a rules standpoint, but it really does highlight the George and Wei relationship that was very rocky the entire way, though it really culminates in a really satisfying way in this episode, where with Haley winning immunity and with George being Flick's target, he does create a plan B, which is a very simple vote split, putting his and Kara's votes on Wei so that she goes home if Flick plays an idol. Again, a very basic strategy, but one that we rarely see being done this late into the game. And the obvious other example of this is Devin putting his vote on Mike in HHH, but it is pretty rare to see someone in the majority during the endgame split the vote against one of their own allies in a self-preservation move, when there is a clear target that could possibly have an idol. And it was great to see George execute the plan here, though also frustrating to see Kara consider not going along with the plan and also wanting to loop Haley in the plan, which was an unnecessary risk in my eyes, so that was kind of annoying. Though the plan does go through, Flick does play her idol after really playing up how much she's going home, which did seem super suspicious to me, where I feel like they had to know that she had an idol by the end of that tribal. But with that, Wei goes home in a 2-1-0 vote right after having seen Wei thank George for helping her in the challenge. And let's talk about Wei, who was an interesting figure here. Again, like, her relationship with George was pretty fascinating to watch as it evolved over the course of the season. She did seem to be a respected player by the jury, to where a lot of them talk about the possibility of voting for her. And really, I do think the general perception of her was that she was a better player than she actually was. I mean, Wei does seem to be one of the more level-headed players on the cast, but I do think she has some really poor reads on the game. I don't feel like there is a move in the game that you could really credit to her. With most of the moves that she ends up making, she makes them along with Haley, to where Haley gets a decent amount of the credit, at least in the edit, for those moves. And I did find her edit to overall be very underwhelming, where after the merge, she has this massive dry spell. Because of that, it made it clear to me that she was probably not making it to the end. She was probably getting a boot around this point in the game. Now again, I do like Wei, though she is someone I definitely had no real faith in ever winning this season at this point. Now for episode 23, the penultimate episode, which really focuses on the George and Kara relationship, with the show really propping them up as the strongest duo Survivor has ever seen. And we hear Kara say that George played the greatest game in the history of Survivor. Again, both very exaggerated, but whatever. And we do get this fun moment between the two where Kara tries to teach George how to make fire, only for her not to be able to start one herself, which actually did make me think that they were going to go to fire, though we don't actually end up seeing that. But then we get more of Flick targeting George, which we definitely haven't seen before. And unsurprisingly, Flick ends up winning immunity, which I had no doubt that this was going to happen after the previous night's preview. Both that, Haley is now left in a very vulnerable position where now Flick wants her out as her biggest comp threat. But this is where we see Haley set out to do the seemingly impossible in splitting up George and Cara, which I had little doubt she was gonna pull off, as to me I thought Haley was for sure winning based off the edit, and she was obviously going home based off what we saw if this plan didn't happen, so I always thought this plan was gonna work, though I did question who was going to be the recipient of it. Now on paper, this is a truly incredible move. For Haley to save herself here, where the only way that she stays is to break up a duo that had been together since the very beginning and had even played idols on each other. For her to split them up, it is impressive, and she does so. Though I will say that I do think that challenge strength greatly factored in here over her actually being that manipulative of a player. Because I genuinely think this is the best move for both Cara and George to be making here. It's not like she convinced them to do something against their best interest. She's just convincing them to do something that's in their best interest. And for someone like George, I would not be surprised if he already had this plan to begin with. Again, like, we essentially know that Final Immunity is going to be some sort of brutal endurance comp, to which George and Cara have never done particularly well in, while Flick and Haley have. So by George and Cara going to 3 with Flick, they're essentially putting them in the position where Flick is all but guaranteed to win Final Immunity and in turn probably win the game. While taking Haley brings someone that will take you to Final 2, and also someone you probably have a better chance at winning against in a jury vote, at least theoretically. And obviously has a much higher chance at beating Flick. So for me, for George, and for Cara, this plan made all the sense in the world for them to be voting for each other. And I was not surprised to see George actually go through the plan. I was kind of surprised to see that Cara did. Now, the bigger surprise to me was that Haley did end up siding with George over Cara. Now, strategically, it does make sense if Haley is that confident she could beat George at the end, as Flick is less likely to take George to the end than Cara, in the case that Haley loses Final Immunity. And from what I understand, George was more receptive to the plan back at camp as well, meaning less of a chance that Haley ends up accidentally voting herself out of the game. So again, it makes sense, but I was definitely expecting Cara to be the final 2 GOAT for this season, and for her to be voted out here instead did seem a bit weird to me. But again, to see another 2-on-1 vote here at the Final 4 really does make me miss the genuine Final 4 round back in Survivor US. But with that, let's talk about Cara, who was an interesting figure on this season. She obviously has her super notable relationship with George. That was a fun dynamic on the season. But also, it was interesting to see how the other players had to navigate around her, with her messing up the Big D vote, which seemed to nullify any credibility she had in the game, to where people were very hesitant to add her to their plans in the worry that she would mess it up somehow. And even George had to plan around her at points and had to fight hard to convince her to go his way, and generally seemed to be looked at as a pretty big GOAT by the jury. So she's someone that I really can't say is a good player, but one that definitely had an interesting role on this season. And now for the finale, which was your standard Australian Survivor finale. I mean, we did get some really boring game recaps at the beginning. We get to the immunity challenge where they bring out the players' families, and again, this was still pretty boring to me. I did find it humorous how much they talk about Flick's situation with her mom and needing love from home, only for her to then not get anyone in her direct family coming out for the family visit, which just felt kind of awkward to me. But we do get a pretty cool Final Immunity challenge with it being this like torture contraption. But I never really had any doubt that Haley was going to win, and she does, and unsurprisingly, she eventually votes out Flick. And Flick was someone that I thought was going to win for the first few weeks of the season, but her edit just took a massive dip for most of the late pre-merge and most of the early merge as well, only for her to get screen time once again when the show felt like they needed to show her, which makes me think that, again, they were only showing her when it was absolutely necessary. Now, I do think she is a decent player here. Not great, considering the only time she votes correctly the entire post-merge was during the Haley boot, and even had a spotty record in the pre-merge as well. But I do think she's demonstrated some strong social play during the season, particularly in the pre-merge, and I do think if her alliance had been able to stay in the majority in the post-merge, she probably would have ended up playing a really great game. But despite that, she probably still wins if she gets to the end. I mean, definitely has at least 3 to 4 locked-in jury votes. Though obviously a lot of that more so comes from her story and her being an underdog and her being on the original Brawn than the actual game that she ends up playing on this season. But moving on, we do have a Haley George Final 2, probably the best case scenario for the season, and a pretty big shocker to see the two best players get to the end together, with this also being a situation where I do think it was in both of their best interests to do so, which is something I feel like we've never seen before in the history of Survivor. And again, this was a really interesting endgame. The problem for me was that the edit was so blatantly in Haley's favor that what could have been a really suspenseful final two where we wouldn't know who's going to win here ends up being a pretty predictable result. But we do get to Final Tribal, where I do think George gives a pretty great opening speech where he literally runs through his game from beginning to end. But Haley ends up doing really well here as well, and is probably more consistent throughout the entire tribal. As I do feel like when we get to the questions, George does stumble a bit, particularly with Emmett's question. I feel like he doesn't really have any great response when people mention the lack of his physical game. And even at points where he was saying the right things, I don't think it ever really hit with the jury. Again, to me, it just came down to, I think, the jury's perception that Haley was a more well-rounded player, while George only had the strategic game. So when we get to the votes, George does end up getting the votes of Laura and Cara, Laura's vote being a pretty big surprise to me, actually, while Haley gets the remainder, winning in a 7-2 vote, to which we also have another really awkward vote reveal where we have the family surrounding him, during which is something I always hated from these on-island vote reveals. But again, a satisfying conclusion to the season, where we get one of the best Final Twos in Survivor history, and definitely in Australian Survivor history, which I think is definitely going to be a notable feat looking back on this season years down the road. But with that, let's start talking about the Final Two, starting off with George, who I will say I personally would have voted for George over Haley. I do think George's post-merge game and his maneuvering through it was pretty amazing. I mean, with him making the optimal move for his game at pretty much every turn. I mean, yeah, there were like little missteps here and there, and the way he went about making certain moves was probably not the greatest thing in the world, but when we're looking at the actual moves that were made by the time of Tribal, I do think he played pretty optimally. I mean, he orchestrated many of this season's biggest blindsides. Again, he executed the Kez boot, the Gerald boot, the Way boot, all while keeping Haley and Way on his side and having Haley take him to the very end. I mean, to me, it's all very impressive gameplay. But at the end of the day, he is George. I mean, he is a great TV character and is really the star of this season. But what makes him such great TV is also what gets on a lot of people's nerves while out there. And I think that, combined with his general lack of people skills, made it a struggle for him to win a jury like this. Now, despite me propping up his post-merge game, I mean, he did have a very messy start to the game. I mean, the pre-swap for him was pretty bad. We're pretty much on the outs the entire way through, but even in the post-swap, I do think he plays pretty well there as well. So I personally do look at George's game as pretty strong despite the flaws that he had early on. And with that, let's now talk about this season's winner in Haley, who I think is one of the best players we've ever seen on Australian Survivor. I mean, she is an amazing all-around player. I think we're talking about the best player on this season in terms of the person who would do well on multiple appearances. I think Haley is very clearly the answer and not really close. I mean, again, she's great in challenges. She's able to build really strong social bonds. She's a very cerebral, strategic player. She is a great all-around player, but her winning game here to me is deeply flawed. I mean, the largest of those flaws obviously being her vote out, which is a massive stroke of luck for her, as if she gets voted out in most other rounds, she is straight up out of the game. But she does end up getting the Redemption Rock twist, which ends up directly benefiting her. I also feel like she was a bit too loose with information that ended up harming her perception during that early merge portion of the game. But obviously she had an amazing recovery in the end game. I mean, after she returns from Redemption Rock, she does play a very good game beyond that. I mean, she wasn't voted out. There's no doubt for me that she would be the second best winning game in the history of Australian Survivor. And even now, I think she's probably the second best player in the 10-play series of Australian Survivor. But again, she did not play a flawless game here. And beyond that, I do feel like her win was just so foreshown where from the point of the Joey boot, I had her as my number one contender for the rest of the season. And for me, it just got clearer and clearer over time, which did lessen the impact of her win for me. But despite that, she did pull off some impressive moves. Again, she had the Joey boot. She was able to split up the Brawn post-swap, taking out two massive players in Shannon and Simon. We have the Emmett blindside. She obviously has the 2-1-1. So again, without her vote out, she did play an incredible game. But her vote out is obviously a massive knock against her when comparing her game to the winning games of other winners of the show. But there we go. I mean, that is this season of Australian Survivor, Brains versus Brawn, which was a fun ride, despite the number of flaws I have with the editing and production decisions along the way. We had two really great players outplay the rest of the field here and still somehow reach the final two together, which does boon this season as a whole, especially amongst all the craziness and poor gameplay from the other players on the cast. This was a train wreck of a season, but one that does have a satisfying conclusion. I'll say for me personally, in terms of ranking the Australian Survivor seasons, I've said in the past that Champions vs. Contenders is my favorite season, with 2017 being number 2. I will say the gap between those two have become closer and closer over time, and I will say that Brains vs. Brawn definitely joins that tier. I haven't fully decided which one is the best of the bunch at this current point, but I did really enjoy my experience with this season, despite the worries I have that the flaws within this season are something that will probably carry over into future seasons of the show. But there we go. I mean, that is my review of Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawn. Obviously, I will cover Australian Survivor moving forward, especially with the confirmation of a new season coming early next year. That at this point looks like it might have some returnees, which if it is the case, then you can expect a cast reaction whenever that cast does get leaked. Moving forward, we obviously have Survivor South Africa ending soon as well, so expect a review of that season. And for both this season and Survivor South Africa, you can expect a player ranking in the near future as well. You can also expect the same thing for BB23, which we are nearing the end of as well. Also, I'll be covering American Ninja Warrior. Stay tuned for a review of that in the near future, along with the Circle and the Challenge that are currently going on. And also Survivor 41 is coming up very soon. So there's a lot going on. So expect videos from those things moving down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.